Okay, so have you noticed a pattern that is consistent in your family, which you are uncomfortable with and unable to explain or deal with? Now, this is our destination on the program this week, and if you just tuned in, our focus is understanding and breaking family patterns. Now, before we link up with our first guest, John talked about him earlier on very briefly. May I congratulate Nigerian students and parents, and indeed the entire nation, for the victory. After almost 8 months, the nightmare, we can say, is over. Our students can now happily return to school and pick up the pieces. So much has been broken. They must pick up the pieces. So many talking points still from that ASU, because there is a catch. I hear is conditional suspension. I don't understand all of that.
I don't understand it either.
Conditional or unconditional? This is conditional.
This is conditional.
You know? So there's still so many issues linked to it. But the most important is there's some agreement.
Yes, there's some agreement. And the most interesting thing is that when the news broke, I didn't think it was true. I had to confirm and reconfirm.
Why?
Yeah, because so many times in the past we've heard that, oh, the strike has been put off. Only maybe an hour down the road you hear that, no, that news was incorrect. But I just stepped out of the house and I saw some students who were rejoicing. And I was like, oh, is it true that this strike? They say, yes, I'm going back to school tomorrow. My sister is going on Sunday. So, well, I think we just need to congratulate them, congratulate parents.
No, it's a good development.
For their resilience. Yeah. A lot would have happened in 8 years in anyone's life.
My daughter said to me, so many female students have gotten married.
Wow.
Within this period.
Yeah, I mean, I won't be surprised. I won't be surprised.
Oh, God.
But, well, that's it. Conditional or unconditional, they're back in school.
Yeah, they are back in school.
Yeah. And nobody has wished me Happy Husband's Day.
Oh.
Today is World Happy Husband's Day.
Happy Husband's
Day. If it was Happy Wife's Day, now the women would have been all over the place. But
man, these days are just, people are just digging up all kinds of, what which was Happy Husband's Day?
Happy Husband's Day.
Okay, Happy Husband's Day to you,
Thank
John.
you.
And Happy Husband's Day to all of you awesome husbands out there. Abby?
That's right.
That's done with.
That's right.
Okay, and we're also a bit troubled with the news of the flood almost all over in so many parts of Nigeria, especially in Anambra, where we are told that almost about 14,000 refugees now lament, and the death toll has risen to 17. You know, I remember many years ago when late Ambassador Lushola was talking about refugee situation in Nigeria. Everybody was like, where is this man? What's he talking about? Refugee thing we used to hear in those war-torn nations, nothing relatable to Nigeria. But here we have
it's a reflection of the times.
Refugees everywhere, IDPs everywhere.
It's a reflection of the times. People are not happy with where they are, so they keep moving all around the place. So, well, Nigeria is indeed God's own country, like they say.
Yes, it is.
And the more you look, the less you see. Unfortunately, this is the only country we can truly, truly call home.
It is.
God help us.
God indeed has been helping, and he will continue to help us. Now, no further comments from me, John, on that. I was going to go on something else, but well, let's put a pause on that at the moment. I'm anxious to help families get liberated through understanding and breaking unwholesome and evil family patterns. And so it's time to introduce to you our guest on the show today. He is Chris Abojei, a consultant psychologist and expert in suicide, trauma, and grief management. Our guest spent the last decade in mental health treatment, research, and training. He is a player in the digital mental health solution space and a member of several professional bodies, including the Nigerian Association of Clinical Psychologists, the British Psychological Society, International Society of Substance Use Professionals, and a lot more. Welcome to this family-focused show, Chris Abojei. Hi, Chris.
Thank you for having me. Hello, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good morning. It's good to have you, Chris. And well, let's first thank you for your patience too. We've kept you waiting for a little while. But like we say, the viewers are waiting, and we have a lot of questions to ask. Family patterns is a subject that isn't quite well understood.
Yeah.
Could you just briefly tell us, what is it? What is it, family patterns?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me on the show. So most times when people talk about family patterns, they're usually referring to family systems, structures, responses within the family, more like behavioral patterns, how the people in the family respond to certain situations. Now, over time, that becomes something that is transferred from one family to the other, from one generation to the other. And then they tend to term it as a pattern. It's almost like a system. It's a consistent way of responding within the family. Now, this could be emotional, and it could also be behavioral. That means that families could have a behavioral response to life generally, or situations, and they could also have a emotional response as well. But then what you then notice is that it becomes more like a trademark, like something consistent. In this part of the world, they would term it as a family causes, generational causes, something like that.
Yeah.
They'll say, oh, it's a generational cause, or it's household wickedness, something you need to break. But it's not. It's most times family patterns are not those. They're just systems within the family that has been adopted by every member or most members of the family.
Wow. Okay. Like you said, most of the time the understanding is like it's more in the negative than in the positive. But your response to John's question, says otherwise. So are we right to assume that family patterns are etched in family bloodlines? Is it as deep as that?
Well, it depends on what you mean by bloodlines, right? So I would like to look at it less from a place of bloodline, but more from a place of what it is. It's a behavioral pattern, which simply means that yes, it can be transferred from one member of the family to another, from parents to kids, because it's a pattern. It's based on what they have learned over time, not necessarily because it's ingrained in their blood. It's not so, because when we look at it from a place of, oh, it's a bloodline thing, it makes us begin to think that we can't do anything about it, right? It's like, oh, you know what? I have the bloodline, so I have to always carry this. But when we understand that it's not necessarily a bloodline thing, it's more about an observational thing, it's a learning thing, then we are empowered to do something about it. And that's how I would like to look at it, right? Of course, yes, I can begin to explain the DNA part of it, which is simply that every of our experiences as people or as persons are ingrained in our DNA. And of course, it's recorded and can be passed on to your offspring. However, like I said, it's easier to look at it from a place of, oh, it's something that I learned. And if my father learned it, if he learned it from his father, and I'm learning it from him as well, I can also unlearn it. And I think that's a safer approach.
So
Safer approach.
it's for me, it still remains a myth. A lot of what we hear about family patterns is so mysterious. It's so, it's so is there any word like unexplainable? Well, you see, they say like father, like son. Now, why would a boy exhibit certain similar behaviors of the father or the mother?
Okay. So, in psychology, behavioral psychology to be specific, we have a belief that people are born tabula rasa, which simply means they are born with a blank slate, right? Now, this slate is actually your mind. Your mind is a seat of your experiences over time. However, we are conceived with a blank slate. Now, this simply means that if you're conceived with a blank slate, there is room for programming that mind. The question then is, where do we get the program? Most times, the program is first gotten from the family, right? It's first gotten from the family. The program is first gotten from the family. So, as a child, I grew up observing my father respond to life, respond emotionally, respond, behaviorally, and maybe even spiritually, depending on the situation. And that's how I learned to also respond. And that becomes, a repeat pattern where people can then say, oh, he's just like his father or something like that. It's because that is what I have learned, and that is what has created my own programming. I think that's the best way to explain it actually.
Okay, we also understand that direct relationship between parents and offsprings exists, like you said. Now, how can some even exhibit? Sometimes the children exhibit patterns and behavioral patterns and attitude that can be traceable to the grandparents, either physical appearance or, in character. And they can say, wow, this is like my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother. How does it, how do we explain this?
So in terms of physical attributes, that is more biological, right? It's more biological. And of course, the science of DNA explains that a lot better, that we carry genes, some of them recessive, others dominant. If my father or my grandfather or my great grandfather had a gene, definitely, or certain genetic traits, sorry, definitely he will pass it on to his son to my father, and then to me. However, whether or not I express those genetic traits would be determined by one, is it a dominant trait or is it a recessive trait? And then number two, what are the environmental factors that will lead me to respond that way? Let me give an instance. If, for example, in my family, and this is not in my family, but in my family, somebody used to steal, for example, and they used to steal because they didn't have they didn't have, they couldn't afford to survive or fend for themselves. And then, but my father has found a way to provide for himself, so he doesn't necessarily have to resort to that trait. But then I find myself in a situation where, again, I don't have any other alternative, or I don't have a way to fend for myself. There is already that behavioral response or the genetic trait. I might then resort to that behavioral trait because it's already there, somehow encoded in me, right? And so that's what you just see. You see that families pass on traits, family pass on physical characteristics, they pass on learning, but of course, not every member of the family would exhibit or express those learnings in the same way, right? They would not express it in the same way because there are other factors that could determine how you express a certain learning or a certain behavioral trait or biological trait that you've picked up from your parents or from your, grandparents, as the case might apply.
Okay.
Behavioral, biological. I think you've danced around one very key area that is of utmost interest to us, spiritual. Right? But before we even talk about the spiritual bit, pain, for instance, pain isn't a behavioral pattern.
Is it?
Can this trait also be picked up genetically? Because like a pregnant woman experiences pain or abuse of some sort during her pregnancy. And then the child is born and we find some traits, on that child that reflects that child, has taken, has been connected somehow to that pain. Would that be genetic or even spiritual?
So I would assume that when you're talking about pain, you're talking more about trauma.
Trauma,
right?
yes, that's right.
Okay, because pain in itself is actually a natural human response, right? In fact, it's a survival response. We all need to have the ability to feel pain because it helps us protect ourselves. But when we talk about trauma, on the other hand, again, trauma is, of course, both psychological, right? It's both psychological, and then, of course, it could also be biological. But what you see with trauma is that trauma is generally a distressing event. So, like you talked about the pregnant woman, she has had a distressing event. But the question is, how did she respond to that distressing event? That's the most important thing. It is that response that the child is likely going to pick up. And when you were talking about pain earlier, I was going to respond from the perspective of thresholds as well,
Okay.
whereby I have a stronger, or a better threshold to managing certain kinds of pain. Not because I am better than you, but because maybe my father or my father also experienced certain level of pain or certain level of distress, and they have built a capacity to manage it. And so, if they've built a capacity to manage it, I'm going to not only learn from them, but I'm also going to inherit that genetic code that speaks more about that capacity. And so, you can then see that in a certain bloodline or a certain culture, their threshold to managing pain seems to be a lot better than certain cultures or certain people. Not because they are better, it's just that they have experienced it so far and they've built a response. But when it comes to trauma is more about the response. How do you respond to it? So what you see a lot of times, and I think this speaks a lot to the family patterns when people talk about family patterns, is that families and members of families have experienced trauma. They have responded in a certain way. Their kids have observed their response and also keep on repeating that response. That it then becomes a consistent pattern across generations, which simply means we call that inherited trauma. You are inheriting it, not because you were the one that actually experienced the trauma, but what you did is that you experienced or you inherited you observed the way your mother, your father responds to it.
Okay.
Right? Take for example, how do they respond to conflict? How do they communicate? How do they, manage affection, emotional, situations? You will learn it, and then you will just begin to do the same.
Okay. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Because in some homes, when you have children who are really, really troublesome and stubborn, sometimes the parents can say, okay, so you think you're going that route, I will give it to you double because you probably learned it from me. So these things happen, and you're not so intentional about it. You're not, you're just observing, and it's not something that is right there in our faces. It's just quietly, being picked up without us noticing. So there also seem to be spiritual explanations on the go for some of these things. Would you say, spiritual? Because at the beginning you said we should be able to look at it as some things that are there and we are able to do something about them. Because that's why we're on this show, to begin to find solutions to how we can break them, break out of the ones that are bad, and continue on the path with those that are good. So spiritual explanation, how deep can it go?
So the question then is, what is spiritual, right? I realize that many times when people talk about spirituality, especially from this part of the world, they are talking about demons, household wickedness, stubborn pursuers, and all that. But is that really what spirituality is all about? From a psychological perspective, spirituality is less about household wickedness, demons, and all those things. It's more about your connection with your core self. And in some cases, your connection with a higher power. That's what spirituality is all about. And that simply means that, yes, the way I connect with my inner self, my core self, can also be passed on to my family, because that connection also feeds directly to your mind. It feeds directly to your mind. And I can begin to tell you about spiritual beliefs or religious beliefs that even speaks directly to this. Take, for example, the Christian belief will tell you something about transformation by renewing your mind. They will say, be transformed by renewing your mind. And that tells you that that is a form of spirituality, but it's a form of spirituality that is strongly linked to you being able to connect to your mind and being able to change certain things about your interpretation of your previous experiences. That is what spirituality is all about generally. The
Okay.
human being is divided into the body, the soul, and the spirit.
Yep.
Most times when we talk about religion and all that, we are really talking about the contents of the soul, which is your mind, your emotions, your cognitive reasoning. That is what makes up your soul generally, right? And so your ability to connect to this core self is what really makes up your spirituality, or how spiritual you are generally, at least from a psychological perspective.
All right.
Do
Yeah.
we disagree in household wickedness? No, but most of the time that is not what people really are dealing with.
Okay.
Okay.
We need to quickly go on a break.
Yes, but Helen, can I just quickly sneak this
Okay.
one in?
Okay, quickly.
Now, when we talk about family patterns, does it have to be negative? Aren't there any positive things about family patterns?
Well, yeah, family patterns can also be positive, right? And they're not, but most times you see that the brain is designed in such a way that if it's positive, you're not bothered about it.
It's not
And
newsworthy.
so
It's not
people,
Yeah.
news.
exactly, because it's not a threat.
Yeah.
So people are more likely to focus on the threat, which is the negative ones. But yes, family patterns can also be positive. Take, for example, if I grew up from a family where my parents were quite rich, great investors, that is a pattern that I'm going to pick up, which means that I'm going to be able to manage money effectively. And you can then see that certain families just keep on growing rich and wealthy and wealthy, and you say,
Yeah.
these people are just it's a pattern. They have picked up that pattern. So that's what it is.
And we take the positives for granted, unfortunately. All right.
Exactly, exactly.
Okay, so guys, understanding and breaking family patterns has occupied our minds today on the program in our quest to provide for every family the very best, enjoyable and fulfilled life. And if you permit us, Chris, we will take a quick break at this point to bring some messages. But not to worry, we'll return very, very quickly with some solutions. Chris Abojei is our guest on the show today. He's the expert and he is with us. He will be with us when we return. Please join us again.
Yes, this is your family-centered program, Today with John and Helen on PlusTvAfrica. And this week, we are dealing with foundations, roots, and what many refer to as bloodline, patterns and traits found in families from generation to generation. Our guest, a clinical psychologist, Chris Abojei, is still with us. Chris, we hope you're still there.
Yes, I am.
Great.
Okay. All right, so Chris, it's difficult. This second round is going to be very quick. We don't have too much time, unfortunately. So it's difficult to explain how an abusive father, for example, would have that behavior picked up by the son later in life. Can you put the dots together for us?
Okay, so I think this feeds into what I said earlier about being conceived tabula rasa, blank, right? So what you see is that the child is born with just what we call reflexes, survival reflexes. However, they need to then learn from their environments, which includes the family, the parents, sorry, are a core aspect of that learning process, of course, but not just the parents, also the environment. Now, if there's a problematic behavior in the family, right, there's definitely, that simply means that the child is going to learn that. Why? Because the child is observing and learning from the learning from the parents and the father here, how to respond to life situations. So every time the father is pissed, for example, the father screams. In the child's mind, it means that, the response to being angry is that you should shout, right? If the father, for example, physically assaults the mother when they're having an argument, the child also picks that up and says, okay, it means that if I'm having an argument with somebody, I need to turn to my fist or something like that. So this is not a conscious process. In fact, we think that it's a lot about it's more about unconscious learning, learning by reflex.
Okay.
But that is how we learn a lot of things that we do. So in some cases, you might see a father who is an alcoholic. The son also learns to become an alcoholic. However, there are some situations as well where the kids identify that this is not the kind of behavior they want. Maybe because they interact with friends and they see that, in my friend's house, this is not how they do. I don't like what is happening with my father here. And so they can then say to themselves, I don't want this. And they find a new role model, right? Maybe someone on TV, and they adopt that new behavior. So that is possible. But we have also seen that in that situation, it's also usually towards the extreme. Where you see someone says, I don't want to be poor, and they become workaholics, right? Because my parents were poor. So sometimes I always say to people that it's nice to acknowledge what these patterns are, but it's also very important to be intentional in your decision not to adopt or to unlearn these patterns.
Okay.
But it's all about learning.
Okay, thank you so much for taking me there, because I was actually going to point that out. that some of these negative things that happen in your environment can also be responsible for you to say, no, I don't want to go that route. I want to be better. Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, you know, while you were explaining the last, situation, my mind went somewhere else.
Okay.
You know, now within families and even between siblings, we've seen that while some will pick up certain patterns, others don't, or others wouldn't. What's the explanation for that?
And they're in the same environment.
Family, same environment. So what's happening?
Well, so the question then is, are they really not picking up those patterns, right? Sometimes, yes, they could actually be picking up those patterns, but expressing it in a different way. And I'm going to try to explain. So there are a number of factors that determine whether a child will pick up, or replicate the same patterns the same way as the parents are replicating it. And then one of the factors would be, the relationship that they have, the relationship they have with their parents, the relationship they have with their siblings. Another one would be the birth order as well. What is your birth order? And that's because the birth order determines your exposure within the family. You see that the middle children are usually the neglected ones. The last one is usually the pampered ones. The first one is usually the one who takes a lot of responsibility, right? And so birth order is also very significant in determining, but whether or not you replicate those behaviors. However, when people say, oh, and we've seen a lot of studies like this or experiences like this, where two people grow up from the same family, one person is doing better than the other person. It's not necessarily because they didn't have the same experience or they didn't pick up the same pattern, but they express their patterns differently. That's what you see. They express their patterns differently. So one person can turn to become an alcoholic like the father, right? And the other person says, you know what, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to drink, but rather I would become, I would try to become wealthy. Now, but you see that there is a pattern here. The pattern is not necessarily alcoholism. It's an obsession to something, an obsession to using a coping mechanism to solve a problem. So in this case, the father uses alcohol to solve his problems. This other child grows up using alcohol to solve his own problems like the father. The other one decides that, you know what, no, I'm going to rather put in effort into working hard as a way of solving my problems. And so what you're now seeing is you're seeing two different expressions, but it's stemming from the same pattern, but different expressions. So you can say, but why are you not responding like your brother? Why are you not? So that means this one is different. And some people will then attribute it like a miracle. God has intervened in this one's life. It's not that the patterns are different. It's just that the expressions of these patterns are different.
Okay, we still have lots of questions, but because we started this show late today, we're being asked to round off. Chris, you have been so helpful. We're thinking we'll be able to look at, a few takeaways in terms of when you notice these things early in the children, patterns, family patterns and traits. How do you go about, working on them right away? But unfortunately, we do not have the time to go into that. But if someone was just joining us on this show right now and you needed to leave a word, with such a person as it relates to, understanding and breaking family patterns, what would it be?
I would say first, and that's the fact that what I said earlier, which is that patterns can be learned and they can be unlearned. So if at any point you recognize a pattern, do not just accept and say, oh, this is who I am, right? It can always be unlearned. Now, it might take a lot of work and patience and consistency to break certain patterns or unlearn certain patterns. But if you really are concerned about it, then you need to put in the work. And I think my final words would be to parents. Parents need to understand that the family, parenting, is the most important institution in the world. It's the most important institution. And so parenting should be done deliberately and not by trial and error. What you see is that parents have the best intentions, but most times parenting is done by trial and error because you spend 4 years going to school to learn how to become, an accountant, but nobody really invests in learning how to become a parent. And so they are still struggling with their own trauma. They get married and they keep on repeating the same patterns and their kids pick it up. So as parents, you need to understand that it's not just your life at stake. Your children and their children, they also have a stake in this. And so you need to parent intentionally.
Okay.
You need to parent intentionally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. No wonder the good books tell us to seek wisdom, seek knowledge, and understanding. We have been extensively schooled today on this topic, and I'm so glad we thought it wise to bring it up. John?
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much.
And really,
Pleasure.
the mystery, surrounding our topic not only explains, but it has also given us the tools on how to break
them.
those mysteries.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Wow. Now the program is still today with John and Helen on Plus TV Africa. Up next, very quickly, if we have the time, let's just stop at the gym. And I know that our beautiful, beautiful Dolly, the gym instructor, is waiting. And after that, Pharaoh joins us.
Yes.
With her guest, and they will be looking at a topic that I can't wait to hear about. It's finding love online. John, don't ask me if I'm about to do that. That should be very intriguing and interesting for all ages. So please stay put. When we come back when we come back from the gym, we will be meeting Pharaoh Shonoga with her guest, Dari Olatoye, who is co-founder and chief executive officer of True Flatter. But first, again, like I said, off we go to the gym.